Okay, Fortnite's off. Maybe I can read the last 12 pages in peace. She looked at his perfect face. She thought that more than anything, she wanted this to go as her had in her heart. But what if she failed? What if she was just another case of big talk, little do, and eventually he would tire of her, leave her? I know so much as it's hard to be sure just where this best place to begin. If I go too fast, raise your hand. He waited, and when he saw her the helplessness in her eyes, he realized he had never loved her quite so much or so deeply. Will you not try not to laugh at me? I would never embarrass a beginner such as yourself. It would be cruelty itself to mock your ignorance, when I, of course, am totally wise. Do we begin standing up or laying down? A very good question, that, Buttercup said quickly. Not having the least notion what else to say. There was great controversy as to which. Well, perhaps it would be wise to cover both contingencies. Why don't I get a blanket in case laying down carries the day? The blanket he brought was spread for them was soft, the pillow softer still. If we were to lie down, Wesley said, lying down, we start closer together on the blanket or far apart. Again, great controversy, she replied. You see, one of the problems with knowing so much is that one sees both sides of questions. You are very patient with me, and I appreciate that. He held out her hand for her. What could do this? We could try lying close together on the blanket and experiment more or less. Buttercup took his strong hand. My professors were all in favor of experimenting. They were very close on the blanket now, the breeze seeing this, knowing what they had been through to reach this moment. Thought it might be nicer to caress them. The stars, seeing this, thought it might be nice if they dimmed for a while. The moon went along, and the whole notion, slipping half behind a cloud. Buttercup still held his hand. She wondered for a moment if it would be wise to stop now. Tell truths. Tell truths. Try again another evening. She was about to suggest that, but then she looked deeply into his eyes. They were the color of the sea before the storm, and she read in them what she read in them gave her the strength to continue. I think I like the sunset. I think the sunset would be a lovely time, Buttercup said. I think he would like that, opening his eyes to the world at that moment. Yes, sunset it shall be. She was speaking at breakfast to the others as they all agreed. In point of fact, since none of them had the least bit experience with birthing, they could all hardly argue. No one could argue with Buttercup's handling of herself. She had blossomed in the 9 months since she and Wesley first made love, had dealt with her situation with a serenity and remarkable in one so young. True, the first months brought a touch of morning sickness, and yes, it was discomforting. But all she had to do was to banish it, was look at Wesley and tell herself she was bringing another such as he into the universe. And poof, the sickness was in retreat. She knew her firstborn would be a boy. She had the dream of the first month that it would be so. The dream reoccurred 2 more times. And after that, she never doubted. And she behaved throughout as if she was the most normal of human conditions. You swelled, certainly, but that didn't stop you from your regular life, which in her case often consisted of helping Physic cook, helping Inigo mend his heart, while walking and talking with Wesley, discussing their future, where they would settle, and what they might do with the rest of their lives, considering the most powerful man on earth was still out to kill them. After the meal, she was ready. Wesley had made a special birthing bed of the softest straw and pillows, softer still. It faced west, and he built a fire nearby. He had kettles boiling with pure water. An hour before sunset, When her contractions were but 5 minutes apart, he carried her to the bed and set her gently down, and sat alongside her, massaging her. She was so happy as he was. By the time the sun was starting to set, the contractions were but 2 minutes apart. Buttercup stared at the sun and smiled, took his hand and whispered to him, "It's what I've always wanted most on this earth, bringing your son into life at such a time, with you beside me." They were both so happy, and Wesley told her, "We are one heartbeat," and she kissed him softly and said, "And always will be." During this, Inigo was fencing with shadows. Excellent practice if you have no proper opponent to play with. Wesley, of course, was superb, and they had spent many hours happy slashing away at each other. But now as the sunset ended, Inigo made ready to stop soon and go welcome the baby. Physic usually watched them, or Inigo alone, when that was the case. But not this night. He was hiding on the far side of one tree, the sky topper, and he was holding his stomach and trying not to groan or to be a bother. But the truth was this: for the strongest man on earth, for a man who earned his living inflicting pain, Physic was squeamish. He could handle blood as well as the next fighter, and when it came from an opponent. But he had asked Wesley and Inigo what it was going to be like when Buttercup's son was born. And though neither of them were an expert, they both indicated there might be some blood as well as some other stuff. Physic rolled on the ground as the phase other stuff went through his being. There was a Turkish word that described such things, boyak. Physic held his stomach and thought of boyak over and over. He knew from looking at the stars overhead that the boy would shortly arrive. But by midnight they knew something was wrong. The contractions were but 1 minute apart as they looked out at the sun's afterglow. But that was where they stayed. At 10 they were still as before, and Buttercup could have handled it quietly as she had the preceding hours. But at midnight her back began to spasm. She could withstand that. Wesley was beside her. What were the spasms? She was settling in for a long visit with them, until the pain crept in from the back of her hips, found one leg, then both set them on fire. The blaze in her legs was the beginning of her torment. Her color faded, but she was still Buttercup, and she was lit by the glow from the flames. She was still then something to see. And there's a picture of the baby, which hasn't come yet. I don't know why they put it in that page. It was not till dawn that they saw that what the pain had done to her. Wesley stayed alongside, rubbed her back, massaged her legs, toweled her perspiring face. He was wonderful. By noon they knew something was very much wrong. Physic rumbled over, took a look, and ran back and hid it to his spot. Helpless, Inigo grabbed the six-fingered sword and fought with the breeze until he realized the sun was going down again. They went into the second day. "I don't want you to worry," Buttercup whispered to her beloved. "Nothing unusual so far," Wesley replied. "From all I've heard, 30 hours is perfectly normal." "Good, I'm glad to know that." When the next dawn came, it had clearly begun to weaken. She managed to say, "What else have you heard?" And Wesley said, "Everyone agrees on this. The longer the labor, the healthier the baby. How lucky we shall be to have a healthy son." By the second sunset, it was only about survival. Physic sobbed behind the trees as Wesley counseled with Inigo. They spoke evenly, but terror was starting to circle about them. "I don't know of such things," Inigo said. "Nor do I. I've heard of cutting that can save the life. You can cut the woman somehow. And kill my beloved? I would kill whoever tried." Just then Buttercup cried out, and Wesley ran to her, dropped beside her. "I'm sorry to be such a bother. What caused the scream?" Buttercup reached for his hand, held it so tight. "My spine is on fire." Wesley smiled. "How lucky we are." Once that happens with the spine, we'll say that's a clear signal that our son is about to be born. The spine is nothing, not when you get to use it. I've had real pain. When I heard Roberts had killed you, that was hard to deal with. I suffered then. But this, she tried to snap her fingers, but her body was not obeying her. Nothing. Inigo and I were just talking about where to go once we are a family. Remember how before I left your father's farm, I was thinking of America? That still seems like a good notion to me. What do you think? She whispered, America. Yes, across the ocean somewhere. And what do you know when I first loved you? Tell me. Well, we were young, and you had just berated me terribly, called me a dullard and a fool, as you did in those days, farm boy. Why can't you ever do anything right, farm boy? You're hopeless and dull, and you'll never amount to anything. Buttercup managed to smile. I was horrible. On your good days you were horrible, but you could be much worse than that. And when the boys started coming around, you were the worst. One evening when they had all gone away, and I was in the barn brushing horse, and you came out humming and silly and said, I can have any boy in the village, and la-di-da. And I went to my hovel and I said to myself, that's it, you can keep those idiots for all I care, I'm gone. So I packed my belongings and I started out of the farm, and I looked up at your window and I thought, you will be sorry for humiliating me, because I will come back here someday with all the wealth in Asia. Goodbye forever. You really left me? That was the theory, but the reality was this. I turned and took a step toward the gate, and I thought, what value has all the wealth in Asia without her smile? And when I took another step and thought, but what is that smile comes, and you were not here to see it? I just stood by your window and I realized I had to be there in case your smile happened, because I was so helpless when it came to you. I was so besotted by your splendor. I was so ecstatic to be near you, even though all you did was insult me. I could never leave. She smiled the sweetest smile she could manage. Wesley gestured for Inigo to come closer. I think we've rounded the corner, he whispered. I could see that, Inigo whispered back. But they were living on a hope they both knew they were, and Wesley held her so gently as her breathing grew increasingly weak. Inigo patted Wesley on the shoulder, as one comrade does to another, nodded that all was going to be well, and Wesley nodded back. But Inigo knew in his heart this: it was soon to be over. And behind the tree, Physic alone gasped, because he knew this. He suddenly was not alone anymore. He began to try to fight it, because something was invading him, invading his brain. And the Lord only knew his brain could use a little help, but Physic struggled on, because when you were invaded, you never knew who was coming along for the ride, a helper or a damager. Someone good or more terrifying, someone who wished anguish. Physic's mother had been invaded the day she first met his father, for she was far too shy to approach him and flirt the way Turkish lasses were supposed to do in those days. So she just stood aside while the other village girls swooped him up. And she wanted Physic's father, wanted to spend her life with him. She knew that, but she was helpless, so she scuffed away, leaving the field to the braver girls. But the invasion came, and suddenly Physic's mother was brassy, and her temporary new tenant gave her the confidence to wonderful things. So back she went to join the other village flirts, and she outdid them all. With her flaunting smile and her wondrous way her body moved. At least it did that day. And Physic's father was smitten with her, and even though the invader left that evening, they got married, and his mother was so happy. And his father only wondered as the years went on, wondered whatever happened to be to that glorious brazen creature who had won his heart. Physic could feel his power going as the invader took control. At last, his last thought was really a prayer, that please, whoever you are, if you harm the child, kill me first. And by the fire, Wesley held Buttercup all the more tightly, and said words of optimism, and Inigo always replied in the same tone. until the awful 50th hour of Buttercup's labor, when Inigo could lie no more and said the dreaded words, "We've lost her." Wesley looked at her still face, and it was true. He had done nothing to save her, not once in all his life except for when he was in the machine, and he never let tears visit, not even when his beloved parents were tortured in front of him. Not once, never the one time. Now he fauceted. He fell across her, and Inigo could only watch helplessly, and Wesley wondered what he was going to do. Until he died, because going on alone was not possible. They had battled the fire, swamp, and survived. If he had known how it was going to end, Wesley thought at that moment he would have let them die there. At least that way they would have been together, and then from behind them there came a sound more strange than any they had come across before. The disembodied sound, as if a corpse were talking. The sound boomed out at them. "We have the body." Inigo whirled, then cried out in the night, and Wesley in despair was so surprised at Inigo's sound he whirled, and he too cried out in the night. Something was moving toward them out of the darkness. They both squinted to make sure. Their eyes did not deceive. Physic was moving toward them out of the darkness. At least something that looked like Physic was coming toward them. But his eyes were bright, and his pace was quick, and his voice, they had neither ever heard a voice like that, so deep, thunderous, and measured. And the accent was something they had also never heard before. The accent, sorry. Not until they finally reached America, or more accurately, when the ones left alive got there. "Physic," Inigo said, "this is not the time." "We have the body," Physic said again. "We have the fine, strapping child inside. She has been kept waiting far too long." Now the giant knelt beside the still woman, gestured for Wesley to move, and put his ear to her, clamped his hands sharply. "You," he said, pointing at Inigo, "bring me soap and water to disinfect my hand." "Where did you hear that word?" Wesley asked. "I don't know, but I think it better to do it," Inigo said, hurrying to the fire. And now Physic pointed to the great sword. "Sterilize it in the fire." "Why?" Inigo said, bringing Physic the soap and the towel. "To make the cut." "No," Wesley said, "I will not let him give you the sword." Now the voice took on power more frightening than ever. "The child is a Putner. That is what we call those that linger too long. But this child is more than that. She is in backward, and the umbilical cord is tightening around her throat. Now, if you wish to live your life alone, keep the sword. If you wish a child and wife, do what I tell you." "Be at your best," Wesley said, and he nodded for Inigo to hand the great sword to the giant. Physic marched it to the fire, sizzled the red point, returned to the lady, knelt. "The umbilical cord is very tight now. There is little breath left now. There is little time." And for a moment Physic closed his eyes, breathed deep, then he moved. His great hands were soft, and the giant's fingers so skilled. And as Wesley and Inigo stared, Physic's hands did the bidding, and the sword touched Buttercup's skin. And then there was a cut, long but precise. And then there was blood, but Physic's eyes only blazed more deeply. His fingers waltzed, and he reached inside and gently took her out. Took the child out. A girl. Buttercup was wrong. It was a girl. And here she at last came, pink and white, like a candy stick. Here came Waverly. I don't know if Buttercup's dead. I'm surprised the author is not moaning about Morgenstern or making up some lie. 4. Physic falling. She was considerably below him at the start, twisting and spinning from the momentum and wind. Physic had never seen the world like this from this high, 15,000 feet with nothing below to break the fall, nothing but the far end rock formations. He called after her, but of course she could not hear. He started after her, but of course he was not gaining. There is no significant laws explaining that bodies fall at the same speed no matter how different size, but makers of the laws had never tried explaining physics, because his feet, so useless at finding holds in sheer mountains, were unmatched at flutter kicking in falling air. He cupped his fingers so his hands were perfectly hollow mitts, and they set to work, swinging his arms, fluttering his feet, so that if you tried to watch them, you couldn't, and then physics strained still more. And the distance between them began to close, from 100 feet to a half, and then half again. And he was that close. Physic called out to her his word. Keyed? She heard and stared up, and when he had her eyes, Physic made her favorite silly face. The one with the tongue touched the tip of his nose, and she saw it. Of course, she laughed out loud with joy, because now she knew that what all this was, just another of their glorious games that always ended so happily. From the start, they were different. Sometimes when she was very little and dozing, Physic was helping Buttercup. Sometimes when she was very little and dozing, and Physic was helping Buttercup, I guess she lived. She would say she has to tinkle, and Buttercup would answer, no, she doesn't, she's just, and then she would stop before she got fine, because Waverly had blinked awake soaking wet. And Buttercup would look at Physic in those moments with such a look of wonder. Or sometimes Waverly and Buttercup would be playing happily, Physic watching, always there, watching so close. Buttercup would say, Physic, why do you look so sad? And Physic would say, I hate it when she's sick, and at night the fever would come. He knew when she was hungry or tired. He knew why she was smiling, and when the crankiness was just around the corner, which made him in Buttercup's mind the perfect babysitter, since how could you improve on a sitter who knew what was going to happen? So Physic looked after her constantly, and when she dozed he would sit between Waverly and the sun, which was why when she started to talk she called him Shade, because he was that, her shade in those earliest days. Later, when she learned games, she had but to blink in his direction, and he knew, not that she wanted to play, but which game. Wesley agreed with Buttercup that, although yes, theirs was an unusual nurse-child relationship, it was a blessing, since it provided her with time to heal and recover, and better yet, time for them to be together. So Physic and Waverly learned from each other and enjoyed each other. Occasional spats, of course, but that comes, as Buttercup explained to him one day, while mothering. Can Waverly come play in the whirlpool with me? Physic would ask constantly. Buttercup would hesitate. It gets her overtired, Physic. Please, please, please. Buttercup would give in, of course, and off they would go, stopping first at the cloth spin, then into the water. Waverly sitting securely on his head, his hands gripping her feet, and whoosh, it was truly magical watching them, as Inigo and her parents did often, because Physic, having conquered the whirlpool, had befriended it, and he could kick up to speed and then swim into the whirlpool and let it carry them around, with Waverly shrieking and Physic keeping balance as they rode the water together, their favorite game, which always ended so happily. Physic was close enough to reach out now, so he did. He brought the child into his arms and made another face. Took her fears away. Shade, she said so happily. 3,000 feet now. Next he pulled her close to him. 2,000. He knew as the rocks flew up toward him that he could never save himself. But if he could bundle her next to his body if he could lie flat in the air and bring her into his arms so his mighty back took the initial assault. There was a good chance she would be shaken, yes, shaken terribly, but she might live. He made his body flat against the wind. He pulled her to him with all of his sweet strength, Keyed, he finally whispered. If you ever need shade, think of me. One final silly face, one blessed responding laugh. Physic closed his eyes then, thinking only of this. Thank God I was a giant after all. Physic falling. And, that's the end of Buttercup's Baby. That is the entire book read. Cupcake, I don't know if you watched any of these videos, but I really hope you did, and I hope you enjoyed it.